Hello and welcome to the third episode of Happy Plants. Hey, Claire, waving at us. Happy Plants is all about helping consumers find healthy, happy plants either in the marketplace or to cultivate their own, which is what these first three episodes have been about, home grow and how to make your own happy plants. So this third episode, the third in three of home cultivation, is all about happy harvest and storage. So how to like take it down and then keep it and really just maximize the shelf life and enjoyment of the product. So thank you for joining us. I'm going to now give it to Claire Erickson from our wonderful partner and sponsor, Boveda, to give you a quick message, and then she is going to turn you over to our esteemed, entertaining, brilliant, and beautiful panel. So thanks, guys, and I'm out of here.
Hi, everybody. Good evening, wherever you may be. My name is Claire, and I have the privilege of working to help save the terps with Boveda, the original terpene shield. I just wanted to congratulate you all on completing a successful home grow. I know that it takes a lot of time, care, and love to grow plants, but in return, they really have a lot to offer us. So all that work, it really needs to be protected, and that's where Boveda comes into the picture. If you're not familiar, Boveda is a packaging and storage solution, which is really like a little humidifier for your flower. Boveda is made with an all-natural saltwater solution, and what that does is forms a monolayer shield of purified water over your plant's trichomes, ensuring that your terpenes, which are those little tasty aromatic compounds, stay intact until you're ready to consume them. So Boveda is proud to facilitate conversations such as this one today to help ensure that your cannabis experience is the best that it can be. And with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed moderator, Mr. Drew Emmer.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire Erickson. And thanks everybody for being here today. I spent the better part of the last 3 days going through the previous 2 episodes of Happy Plants that the Cannabis Certification Council put together. And if you get a chance to get onto YouTube and go back and watch 101, 202, and now this will be the 3rd episode of 303. Incredible panelists, wonderful, smart people, a lot of different disciplines. I'm just thrilled to be here, and I'm going to try to play referee and keep this thing moving. And without further ado, get you introduced to the 3 panelists. We have a scientist, a harvester, and an author. The scientist that's with us today is Andrew Samann from Orion GMP. Andrew, hello, and please give us a minute or 2 about you and Orion GMP.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be on here. My name is Andrew Samann. Got a background that spans from the United States Marine Corps and quality management of helicopters to biochemistry and the applications of pharmaceutical science. And a lot of that has culminated into the application of good manufacturing practices in cannabis, with a very special focus in cannabis quality. How do we measure that? And how do we take what senses we have for a cannabis flower and turn that into something that's objective and concrete, measurable, and then comparable across any jurisdiction?
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. And then I said harvester, but I really should have said cultivation expert, because harvester sounds kind of narrow for what I know your experience to be. Jamal Baker, please tell us about yourself and what you do and where you're from.
Hi, my name is Jamal Baker. Born and raised in the Bay Area. Started growing cannabis at age 20, so in 2002. I've worked in recreational grows. First started medical in California. Eventually I moved to Washington. Worked at a couple recreational locations in Washington. Moved back to California. I've grown in Mendocino, grown in Dublin, Roanoke Park, Oakland, Berkeley, all over the place. A couple years ago, I started working at Berkeley Indoor Garden, which is the oldest grow shop in the United States that's still open. They were open in '81, I believe. And from doing that kind of work, kind of opened me to working with a lot of beginners, working with just all different types of people, teaching them how to grow happy plants in all different types of ways. So, I'd say I'm kind of a jack of all trades. Yeah, that's my experience.
That's awesome. Thanks, Jamal. So then we have Johanna, the H is silent silver. Johanna is an award-winning author. Do you have your book handy, Johanna?
Of course, come on.
What's it called?
Growing Weed in the Garden.
Show it to us again.
A no-fuss seed to stash guide to outdoor cannabis cultivation.
Awesome.
I'm not from the weed world. I'm from the super fluffy lifestyle publishing world. I worked at Sunset Magazine out here in California for 10 years. And my adventure with weed began as an assignment for the San Francisco Chronicle to grow in my backyard and document it as a gardener. And gosh, it's hard to find information for a gardener, not a somebody who wants to grow indoors for profit. So I wrote that book with the help of a lot of mentors along the way, very much including Jamal. Yeah, and my book came out in March when the world shut down, and here we are.
This is great. So I'm going to want to get a copy of that book. Where can I get it?
Anywhere books are sold.
That's good. That narrows it down.
Yeah.
So thanks for that introduction. And we're going to start with you and get you to tee this up for us, because when we were planning for this, I was mentioning that this is the most wonderful time of the year in the cannabis industry because it's harvest season. And we want to get really basic about this so that anybody at any level can tap into the resource of the smart people that we have on this call. Johanna, can you talk about this timing business and how you have a sense or a clue that it's time? Is it time to harvest the plant? And what's it feel like? What's it look like? How many times have you done it? Just give us some background again around that so we can have a sense.
Sure. So there are a lot of different methods that people use. One of the most popular is to check if the trichomes are cloudy or not with a little bit of magnification. But I've seen with my own eyes the super high-res amazing photography of someone named Eric Nugshots. Do you guys know him? And it's actually shown that if you change the vantage point of a trichome, it might look cloudy or clear. So I don't use that one. So I use two others. One is the color of the hairs, all those stigmas that are growing out of the plant, when about half of them are amber and half of them are still the color they were when they were growing. That's when my ears perk up and I start to really pay attention. And then the other one came from Jamal, actually, when I walked in there one of the times that I was panicking, and he taught me about squeezing the nug. So you just squeeze the nug, and if it's firm, it's ready to go. If it's spongy, wait. And those are the two totally approximate, not official, not scientific methods that I use to time it for, decent THC.
So you mentioned being panicked when Jamal came to the rescue and gave you the lowdown on what to do. How nervous should people be if this is their first harvest, if they've been tending to these plants for the last 8, 10, 12 weeks, whatever it is, and what can they really screw up?
Well, to be fair, I was panicked about smell. I was really freaking out about smell, which maybe we can get to later. No, they shouldn't be panicked at all. It's a plant. It's like, when do you harvest that tomato? Today or tomorrow? It's not a tomato if you wait a day. And I think people really freak out that there's this one magical time that they need to harvest their weed. And I like seeing Andrew nod yes, because it means I'm not all off if I say, you're still going to get a decent, I would like Andrew to speak to the science of this, but what I've heard is what I'm timing for is maximum THC. And if you let it go too long, then you get CB something and you just get sleepy instead of high. I mean, you're still getting a plant that's going to have some impact on you.
Go for it. When she asks for comment, go for it.
Yes, ma'am. I wouldn't say that how you describe harvest parameters are out of bounds for anyone that's growing at home. Really, you need some type of subjective measure, whether it's the firmness of the bud or some type of appearance with pistils and colors and senescence of those pistils. And then also when you look at testing parameters, the most concrete method, if you were to think of like pharmaceutical production, would be how are we going to measure the senescence of THC biosynthesis? And it means, how do we know when it's reached its chemical maximum for production of THC? And as you were saying, the CB something is CBG in that case, the precursor to THC. So when you start looking at those ratios, you can measure what would be optimal production of THC. Now, as Johanna had said, it might be today, it might be tomorrow. And then when you think of the scale of harvest, if you have 10,000 plants, well, you're going to want to time that really well. But for individuals that are growing, it's something that I think you get the fingertip feel for over time. And no, there's nothing to be scared about, because the damage that would be done there isn't that great. I actually think that the preservation afterwards becomes more important than the exact date of harvest. And really, like when we look at cannabis flowers, when you put them in your hands and you smell them, you'll know when it's right over time. I mean, I think that Jamal would be able to speak to this too. It's like the fingertip feel of the master or the sensei that knows exactly when to time something for specific effects. So that would be my
Yeah,
story.
and I mean, and I would completely agree that, you know, ideally we have certain tools in the field, like a magnifying glass, like, you know, various other tools to tell when your trichomes are ripe, when your buds are ready. But, you know, sometimes you go into a garden, all you have are your hands and your senses. One thing that I think is, you know, maybe not as often brought up is sometimes you're just trying to wait your harvest out because you have various issues in the garden. So you may have some bud rot, you might have some spider mites or some broad mites. And so, you know, harvesting is almost like a cost benefit. You know, do you want more unripe buds, or do you want a little less buds that are more ripe? And so that, you know, that is a really crucial thing when it comes to harvesting your buds. And really what it means is that 2 or 3 steps before that, you have to be applying your IPM program, applying your, you know, your pesticides and your fungicides, so that then when you get to this point, you can actually have the privilege of letting your plants go all the way to the end. Because very often you have to cut them when you can. You know, there's different things coming in. If you play all your cards right, then, like I said before, you have the privilege of letting your plants fully show their whole maturity level. And, you know, also, like, you know, should people be stressed out about harvesting? Honestly, harvest time can be stressful for people, especially when you have, you know, a fair amount on the line. Even if it's your home garden, for a lot of people, that's the cannabis that they'll be smoking for the whole year. And so instead of being stressed out about it, what I always encourage people is to plan ahead. Plan ahead with your dehumidifier, plan ahead with your space, with your carbon filter. You know, like for example, when I was talking with Johanna, she didn't have a drying space. And so that was the first thing that we figured out, was a clean space that's dry, that's not your bathroom, that's not a room that's close to a main road where people may smell what you're drying. So, you know, that's a very important aspect of drying. I guess the next part is, in my opinion, would be the most important factor, not necessarily when it's being cut, but more like Andrew was saying, what you do after that and how well that's planned.
Jamal, I've actually got a question. What do you think about differential harvesting, like taking off the top cola and then allowing lower buds to mature more? Because I think that's pretty realistic for a lot of home gardeners.
It's an amazing technique. It will extend your harvest, especially in California now, where we've noticed plants are flowering earlier and crops are finishing earlier. It used to be called Croptober because people would crop in October. Now it's Crop September. So yeah, it's a great technique. I will say that with the more exotic strains that are coming out now that are more indica, it's the whole plant that usually that finishes at once. And it's not as much the sativas where you can take the tops and then let it ripen and then take the tops, you know, and do that multiple times.
That's a really good point. I mean, at the end of the day, there are so many different factors related to the genetics and then the environment and when that harvest timing comes, that if we just assume outdoor production, you just have to experience it and then do it and be very well prepared, like you said, for drying, and you'll see what you get. I think that if you think of any gardener, they experience failure in 1,000 ways before, you know, a few years later, they know what to do. And, you know, these questions just aren't an issue. The big point that I would make is that anyone has the ability to acquire seeds, as Johanna has said, and then plant them and grow them, even in limited conditions, and they'll know what they can produce thereafter.
I would argue that in outdoor growing, harvesting is half the battle and is the harder half, is the harvest. You know, you're not paying for electricity, you have much more space, your light is brighter, but that second half is what kicks your ass. And that's which separates the, you know, not the boys from the men, but the, you know, that's what separates moldy bud from high grade.
Yeah. I don't think anyone realizes how much work harvesting is until they do it. And then it's pretty surprising, especially if it's like one individual and they've got a half dozen or a dozen plants.
Just describe that. Describe the process.
Okay, and everybody likes to freak everybody out about harvesting. And I just think it's not helpful. If you've got all these plants and you're approaching harvest, you got to just describe harvesting. And I have some questions for you guys about my drying room because I think it's out of range of where it should be. So on harvest day, I have two plants that are still growing, and I took down two, one in a container and one in the ground. And I had a big blue tarp, and one of them I cut all the way at the bottom because it was in a container, and so it wasn't that big of a deal. And I dragged it into the drying room, and I actually trimmed the hell out of it this year and I don't normally, because of the wildfires. And I felt like I was getting rid of all the schmutz. I don't know if I was or I wasn't, but that's what it felt like I was doing. The other one was a much bigger plant, and so I didn't saw off the whole thing at the bottom, but I cut branch by branch, and I always try and connect the branch to a little bit of the stem so that I get a hook to just hang it on, and then I have a bunch of clothespins around in case I don't. And I use a freestanding wardrobe that I got at Target, and I just ditched the fabric part, and I put a bunch of hangers, and I added a few more dowels, and I just hang my branches up. And I trimmed them all wet this year, so right away, because of said whatever. But that's another thing that I think people freak out a lot about, is like wet trim versus dry trim. And it's like, it's really up to you, when it's like there's no right way. And skipping ahead a little bit, I guess, just for the home grower, when I was writing my book, I kept asking people like, wet or dry, wet or dry, wet or dry. And then I found out what like all the people do for their own home stash, all these farmers, is they like halfway trim. So they bucket, which is the word in weed for getting it off the bigger stem. And then like you cut a little bit, but you leave it. You don't have it like this ugly turd thing. You have it with more leaves around it, and you store it like that. And then when you open up your stash, you've perfectly preserved all are they not stigmas? Are they pistils and not stigmas? Because I just recorded a whole bunch of videos calling them stigmas.
I'm sorry, my plant biology is a little rusty these days.
No, I'm really relieved because you were calling them pistils, and I thought, well, anyway, so you get them all perfectly preserved, and then you can trim up a little as you go. And that's also a way for a home grower not to have harvest being this huge monstrous thing that hangs over their head, but it's rather this like piecemeal thing. Okay, you hang them up. Okay, you trim it a little bit. Like you don't have, it's not this like production line situation when you're just a home grower.
And definitely, like, especially when you're growing outdoor, your drying and curing process would be completely separate from your trimming process. And so essentially it would turn into like, first is drying, So drying would just be drying your bud so it doesn't rot, so it's smokable. Then the next step would be curing it. So what curing is allowing the microorganisms to eat up the nitrogen in the bud. And that will basically make your bud taste more like THC and not like hay. And then the last step would be then finally trimming it.
Can we go back to harvest for everybody for a second? So my first year, I don't think I had much bud rot. Then again, Jamal, you said the weed I gave you had mold in it. Never mind. Let's pretend that never happened. And then last year, I can't remember. And then this year, he said it was really good though. You guys said it was pretty good. And maybe he was lying, but I don't think so.
It was good. It was good.
Yeah. But this year I was going to get my act together and actually spray with BT every week to prevent the caterpillars from laying their eggs, the butterflies from laying their eggs. I was going to do it. Got a big bottle of BT and I was going to do it. And I didn't do it. And I have so much bud rot this year. I just lost an embarrassing amount of my harvest due to bud rot. So that was actually really interesting when I was hearing you talk about like timing it. Like I could have harvested maybe early and just had less ripe buds, but instead, I don't know. So I think next year is the year that I either give up growing or properly use BT, because this was annoying, super annoying. So if you're out there, it's too late this year, actually. There's nothing you can do. You needed to do it when it started flowering.
Kind of a disturbing trend that I've noticed is initially when I worked at Berkeley Indoor Garden, we would say first couple weeks of flower, you spray BT. Once the nugs come out, you don't have to worry about it. But we've noticed that throughout the whole summer and the fall, the caterpillars have been coming back. The moths have been coming the whole time. I just pulled a bunch of baby caterpillars from buds this morning. So essentially, my opinion is that with global warming, the windows of these various applications has to be longer because the bugs are alive and are more voracious for a longer amount of time.
I am disappointed in that being true, because I guess my whole shtick is just keeping cannabis as a plant, like any other plant in the garden. And I don't spray anything with anything, and I'm fine. You know, like my zucchini has powdery milk. What?
How about your apples?
I don't have an apple tree. I got a persimmon, I got a pomegranate, I got some kiwi, and I got a lemon. I don't spray anything with anything. And you know, and I do fine. I have to rinse my lemons off. They're covered in like soot and stuff, but whatever. But you know, losing close to half my harvest of weed to bud rot is really disappointing and makes me think this is a little bit of a different plant than my zucchini or my tomato. Because the harvest, to your point, the harvest is sort of everything. What happens from harvest on.
So let's go back to, let's separate drying from curing. And Andrew, if you can talk to, and anybody can talk to this, the drying that Johanna set up, telling us about her wardrobe and hangers, etc. Can you talk about the difference? What is drying? How long? What's the actual action? Jamal gave us some details about the chemical reactions that are going on that's changing that flower. Speak to that, please, and differentiate drying from curing.
Yeah, absolutely. So the process of drying, if I may take it a step back, you harvest the plant at the base, and then, as Johanna said, you're then bucking off smaller stems that come off from the main stem. And there are so many variations of how you can dry from there. As it was said, wet trimming versus dry trimming. And those all influence the drying process itself. So for example, if you went from an approach of keeping stems on the bud as long as possible in the process, it would be different than if you removed the buds completely and tried drying them on a tray instead of hang drying them. So that said, the process that someone uses will have the flowers drying out at different rates. And if we look at it at a production scale, we're really trying to get down to a specific water content. As Jamal said, we're first trying to get it to a stage where it's smokable. But then the curing process, separate to that, it's sufficiently dried, but what you're really trying to do is equilibrate the amount of moisture across the entire flower. And there are so many different sizes of buds that come off the cannabis plant. You may have one main cola at the end of a stem, but then you'll have smaller buds down from there. You kind of get differential drying. So this is one of those difficult aspects as well. It's like, where are the trade-offs between how you make sure something is dried well enough? Is that main cola going to be sufficiently dry relative to popcorn buds? By the time you get the main cola dry, you may very well find that the popcorn buds would be over-dried. So the curing process should also equilibrate the water throughout the whole batch and how it's packaged. But in that end, from what we've seen in the data, there are many different ways to cure, some of them better than others, but I think that Jamal would be able to answer that better than I could.
Sure. I mean, as far as drying technique, let's say in our ideal conditions, we would probably want our room to be as cold as possible and at about, let's say, 60 degrees humidity the first week. And the next week we might drop it down to like 55 and then to maybe 50. And essentially you just want your room to be around, 50 degrees and I'm sorry, 50% humidity and as cold as possible. The reason why you want it as cold as possible is that keeps as many terpenes as you can on your buds. Now, in the real world, a lot of times when you're harvesting, your room isn't 50 degrees. So for example, my situation, in my backyard, I have a couple plants and we dry in the garage. Our garage is not 50 degrees. And it's not 50% humidity. Our garage is probably about 40% humidity. And in the middle of the day, it's about 80, 85 degrees. So the cannabis dries faster than we want it to, where it dries quickly and then we have to be on it and then maybe take it out of there and then package it up and then maybe put it back in the drying room. So, kind of like what Andrew's saying, like there's many different ways to get to that same place. And the place is where the bud is, is a homogeneous moisture level that's smokable. I believe it's, like 55% humidity or something to that effect?
If you look at water content, like Health Canada, for example, published 12% initially, and the MCPR, I forget the acronym now, but the Cannabis Act now has a number in it. I don't think we see that much in the States, though, as a requirement so much. Some have water activity as a measurement, but that's about as far as it goes.
So yeah, we don't know exactly, or I don't know the exact percentage of humidity, but I do know that there's many different tests that you can do to kind of, see if your bud is at the right drying level. Can we talk about this now?
Oh yeah, that's actually a perfect conversation.
So, I mean, for me, what I tell people when I used to, when I would work at the shop and they would say, I dried these buds, are they ready to smoke yet? I'd say, well, try some. And the first thing that you do is you take a bud and you put it in your pipe. You try to smoke it in your pipe. If it doesn't smoke, okay, well, it's not ready yet. Wait a little bit longer. Or you put it in your pipe, you get like one good hit and then it kind of gets brown or gets black. Then okay, it's still a little bit moist. It's still too moist. After you smoke it in your pipe and it works, the next step is you would smoke it in a joint. When you roll it up in a joint, at first, you'll probably be like, oh yeah, this is ready to go. It's nice and sticky. You'll light it up, hit it once, and then it will go out. And so essentially, you just keep on drying it, breaking pieces down and trying to smoke it. And then once it gets to the level that smokability where the whole joint will smoke, that's essentially as dry as it needs to be. That's also the level where it will, stay in a jar. Yeah.
As you look at what can actually be measured around this, so ASTM International, it's a standards body, has published a specification for dry cannabis flower, and water activity and its specification is between 0.55 and 0.65. And what that really means is how much water is in the cannabis flower versus the immediate outer environment that surrounds it in a package. And really that seems to be one of the best ways to really measure whether or not a cannabis flower is suitable for smoking. I can say from the work that we've done with Save the Terps, almost all the cannabis that we have analyzed to date has shown that it's below that specification and is very likely too dry. So really the biggest risk that we see is over drying. But on the other hand, at home, you don't necessarily have a water activity meter to say, we just met spec. So that's why I think it still is very important to think of what are the subjective things that you can see, feel, smell, and know, and get the fingertip feel for it, and if you have a good nose for cannabis and you know what's good and what's not good, and you know what smokes well in a bowl and what smokes in a joint well, you'd probably land in that area. But it's interesting to see in California, it's much closer in general to the spec. And when you look at the relative humidity of the environment and different. So we did observe drastic differences between California and Colorado in the water activity and water content. So I think that as we move forward in the industry, we'll see more and more adoption of that as our metric to say, hey, this is what smokes well. I just don't think that there's enough data right now, like actual observational studies where people say, here, smoke this. Is it better? Or is this sample that was not within spec better? And I think that if we extend the logic a little bit further on the medical side, this will be the difference between a medical patient getting an accurate dose of a product to include cannabinoids and terpenoids to a specific therapeutic response. But I think that there's a lot left to be sussed out on the clinical side to say what is what, and having a definitive reason of why, it's so important to get to that specific level of water activity.
So I want to, go ahead.
Can I speak to the home grower who doesn't have any of that equipment and who maybe isn't like packing a bowl every day to check dryness? That's me. So what I do is I go into my drying room and I see when the stems snap, and granted some are bigger than others. So it's not like when the first little baby's stem snaps, and it's not when the last of the last snaps. It's thicker. It's like somewhere in between. And I like press the buds to my ears, and it's like when they sound crinkly like popcorn, then I'm like, okay, today, tomorrow, something. And so then I cut them down smaller and put them in to either like stainless steel or glass. And so when I was also doing research for my book, everybody and their mother has a different way to cure. And even Jamal, you were like plastic or like paper bags or rubber bins or like this, that, and I'm like, why? Like, I don't get it. Why? And then I'm reading Ed Rosenthal's book only on harvesting. And it has like this way of curing, this way of curing, this way of curing, that way of curing. And then there's one line that's like, some growers don't make a huge distinction between drying and curing. They let their weed dry, it was worded differently, and then they store it. I'm like, dude, yes, like why would I have another setup? So then I just throw it where it's going to be stored, and I check it in the morning, and if it feels different, if it feels wet again, then the lid stays off for that day and things get a shake, and the lid goes back on at night. And if it feels wet again in the morning, lid stays off all day. And the day when the weed feels as dry as it did last night, that's when I consider it done.
Well, and part of the differentiation in this type of a conversation between science and the practicality of the home grower is you have some folk ways. So, always the way we did it, we would ask people, how do you know when your weed is right? And they'd say, if it snaps, it's ready. If you squish it and it bounces back, it's perfect. If you squish it and it stays squished and doesn't bounce back, it's too wet. If you squish it and it crumbles all together, it's too dry. That's awesome for the folk way, for the how we've always done it, for the feel of it all. But when you get into an industry and a process, the cannabis culture is becoming industrialized, and now we're at a place where science is starting to intersect with these folkways. Differentiate between drying and curing, and what would ideally happen if you had one of the stories I heard is things in the commercial world go to market too fast, so they don't really have a curing process. Is that true?
In my experience, most cannabis in California was never cured. It was dried and sold.
So what would constitute curing? Is it the management of temperature and humidity up and down, back and forth to get it to tweak a certain way?
Correct. I mean, I would say that curing is having enough moisture in the bud for the flavors to settle and homogenize without it rotting. So it's an in-between. You don't want it so dry that it's bone dry. The herb is not going to cure properly. And you don't want it so moist that it's going to mold, because it's also not going to cure. So it's this in-between stage where you're oscillating the humidity in the container, and from what I've been told, there are microorganisms that are breaking down the chlorophyll. So as the chlorophyll leaves the bud, it becomes smoother. So I believe the chlorophyll leaves through evaporation and through microorganisms consuming it. And yeah, the bud would be smoother, it would break down better. If you ever broke down a bud that wasn't cured properly, it's green. Like when you grind it up in a grinder, it doesn't grind up the same way and the color is green. When you grind up something that's been cured properly, it's almost like white. Yeah.
So what's the impact of the last 2 or 3 weeks or month, I guess it's been, with all these crazy fires in different parts of the West? What's that done to the drying and the curing process for anybody that's, you guys were talking about it when I came on the call, and I'd really love to revisit that a little and just talk about the contemporary impact of what's happened to these crops in these different areas that you're all connected to because of the wildfires and the lack of rain.
I was saying that the farmers that I know are worried about their weed testing positive for heavy metals because of the ash and toxins from the fires. I, as a home grower, and I was watching them on Instagram all like blow their weed with leaf blowers. I don't know. I don't have a leaf blower, and so I didn't do that, and that's why I trimmed. But then I was curious, just from like a home grower, or I guess industrial level, like, you know, this idea of washing your buds is something that sounds so wrong to me. But apparently some people are doing it, like washing it with hydrogen peroxide and then water. And I don't know, Andrew, if you know anything about this, what should people be doing with their weed that got rained ash on for 3 weeks?
It's so hard. I'd need a few experiments and to do design of experiments, minimize the number of samples, and try and crack the code from that perspective. And it's just so hard to say with all the variables, because the soot on the plants, its chemical composition will be dependent on how hot the fire was that was burning in the first place. So it goes from like a dark ash to a white ash, and more complete combustion on the white ash, and slightly different set of carbonates that you'll find in there. So washing that with hydrogen peroxide, I haven't done the, back of the hand chemistry to say, yeah, it looks like that'll actually, change those chemicals into this, or it'll effectively wash it off. I don't think that it is an impossible ask to wash cannabis. I mean, if you think of outdoor cannabis, it gets rained on. So that's not really a big deal. And there are a lot of other herbal medicinal products that get washed before they're done after being dried, probably less of the latter. But in this case, I think it'll be very interesting to see if the ash and the smoke in general, and what the plant is respiring every day back and forth in the environment, will impact the chemotype and throw off, for example, its expression of terpenoids, or its expression of cannabinoids. And really, I think what we'll be looking for this year in California is what type of variation do we see in strains that have been produced in past years, and how are they chemically different with the active ingredients? And I think that'll be a really interesting question. Will, for example, Jack Herrera smoke the same in 2020 as it did in 2019? I don't know. It could be. Is the therapeutic response from it different? Maybe, maybe not. But I guess what we can say is if there is a lot of ash that's being deposited on the plants, we'll see it downstream in extraction operations, and they'll be the first ones to say, because they're taking huge quantities of flour, concentrating them down, and then whatever chemicals are there that are soluble in those solvents, they'll see it in the extracts. And I'd seen this in 2017 and 18 during the wildfires in Northern California, where a group we were working with that was doing hydrocarbon extractions claimed that there was like a smell of sulfur in the extract. And if you have any off smells or something that can be perceived either in the product or when it's consumed, it kind of is what it is, and it's really unfortunate because that will be a significant loss. And it's not like there's crop insurance for these types of things. So
so there is cause for concern.
I absolutely think so. I just don't think that we understand the impact yet, and the testing laboratories I think will know, and this will be reported on. I would pay close attention to what scientists over at AOAC are talking about, and whether or not this is a long-term concern there. But
Andrew, should the home grower get out their leaf blower if they have one? Is that effective?
It's a response. I mean, whether that does more harm than good, I can't really say. I mean, if it's a light dusting and you see it dusting off, then maybe so. I mean, almost any answer that I have, if I give you a solid answer, it's because I've got some type of science to back it up, either in the literature or by experience. And in this case, I just don't know yet, because we don't know how big of a problem it is, right? It may be that this year people don't perceive a difference in the smoke for the home grower. If it were my own garden, I would probably dunk them in water in a 55-gallon drum and let them dry off from there. Like, if I were very concerned, I don't think that is something that would increase contamination, but honestly, like, that's the next concern. Like, when you change something up, like dunking a plant in water, and you've got bud rot, and then you increase the amount of water that's there, it's like, which way do you want to go? It could be the complete wrong thing to do, and we just wouldn't know. But I think this is where it really just comes into being a gardener and testing things and seeing what works and what doesn't. So maybe I'd set aside a small batch early and try washing that off first, and then here's what I would do for the home grower. Thank you. So I would have 2 different sets, early harvest, like today. Go cut your plants down right now. Take maybe, a few buds, dip one in water, and I assume that the hydrogen peroxide might be like to try and prevent microbial contamination or further contamination inside the bud. But then I would have a separate one that I didn't treat with water, and I would try and dry those down, and then probably do some quick tests with it, as Jamal had pointed out earlier, of which would be better. But it's unfortunate because you just can't speed things up like drying and curing. And then I don't know if that would, work in the end. So it's really a tough one. There are no easy answers this year.
We had a question in the chat about how this compares to the wine industry. And I was in Santa Rosa and Points North for most of 2018. And the fires that we had were spectacular. And the wine industry, other than losing certain vineyards, losing crops, the wine industry didn't have really a similar concern that the cannabis industry would have, because the grapes are being processed and the juice was not necessarily impacted the way a consumer would consume cannabis and ingest it primarily into their lungs. I mean, there's a different set of standards for cannabis and for alcohol. I mean, they're too different to really make an apples to apples comparison, or a wine to cannabis comparison. But I don't think the impact on the wine industry was big in terms of toxicology or safety or any requirements that they had to meet. But I think the effects, if any, were it created a different kind of feel about that particular event of that year. It was, there's a story behind that. And it was probably used by the marketing people to make it a special. If anybody's good at marketing, they would have made it, this was the year of the fire. So I don't know if it really converts to a conversation about cannabis, but Jamal, have you been through this before in California and had some answers to these questions about toxicity and testing? And I suppose you haven't had the kind of testing requirements that you have now for more than a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion on testing is just because they test for something doesn't mean that that's a bad or a good thing. And there's many other things that people are using that, that they shouldn't be using that aren't being tested for. So, I don't really know how things are going to fall with testing this year. I've grown in previous years when there was smoke, and we definitely did dip our buds in water. I thought they came out fine, but I've never experienced anything like this year at all in my life. My parents never have. They've lived here for a long time. These fires really are pretty unprecedented, and I just don't know. I mean, I know for definitely 3 or 4 days, it seemed like there was zero UV getting to the plants. And for me, that was almost even more of a worry than the ash coming down, was because if there's no UV coming, all of the different pests and pathogens are attacking the plant, and there's no UV to really fight back. Your plant's immune system is just kind of like, it's not photosynthesizing.
That is such a good point. It's, spot on. UV light is the plant's energy source and also protection of microorganisms on its surface. Like, that is the best explanation why we should be concerned. And I just extend it to, like, how does the chemotype with respect to cannabinoid content and terpenoid content change? Because it has to have an impact. And especially year over year, like you talk about the vintage, well, this year will likely be different.
And also something interesting is I've done a fair amount of breeding this year, which is kind of failed, but I wonder if all of these seeds will have these kind of fires imprinted on their genetics.
Fire genetics, man. It's going to be good.
Okay, so let's shift the context to talk about what happens after the breeding process and sort of zero in on, I've always been smitten with the growers that I've talked to, that they've put all this blood, sweat, and tears into a crop, and they get to harvest, and they're so excited to get to market. And there's this gap at the end of the process, which is really where our business fits into the world of helping people preserve their products. So can you speak to, Jamal, can you start us off with some basics about what you put it in, how you store it, where you store it, how long, what the shelf life? I mean, just kind of go there. You're muted, brother.
Sorry. I like to hold cannabis in jars of various sizes. Ideally, you keep it in a jar that has as little air in it as possible. The two will age your weed the fastest will be light and oxygen. So ideally, you want a low oxygen environment and the least amount of light in there. In general, I've smoked buds that are a year old. I like to keep it for about 6 months. At about the 6-month point, it starts to degrade fairly rapidly, in my opinion. There are new technologies out there, like, for example, Bovita packs, refrigerators, like curadors that are just for cannabis. But if you're not using those, 6 months is the shelf life. And at that point on, every month, in my opinion, it starts to steeply go down in quality and terpene content.
And it probably has something to do with where you are as well, because if I'm up in the Lost Coast, Northern California, I have certain ambient circumstances that preserve bud longer than if I'm in Colorado or if I'm in Nevada. I mean, the relative humidity in Nevada a couple days ago, I was checking because I'm going on a trip, I think. It was like 6% relative humidity. So if I had cannabis flower, and I even left the bag open. I was at MJ Biz and somebody opened their bag on the coffee table and they left it open for about 10 minutes. 10 minutes. And they said they had a significant degrade in the quality of the bud in the bag because it's so stinking dry in Nevada. So I think there are probably some variables as far as where you are and how you do it. The general consensus is people are looking for advice on how to standardize what they do. What's the home grower going to do? Are they going to get one of these little gizmos? You know, we do a lot with our friends at Seavault. They were really responsible for helping us get our start in the cannabis industry because we started in another industry and then came upon cannabis. What's the home grower doing as far as what are they keeping it in? How long are they keeping it? How long are they able to? I mean, if I grow 6 plants and I get, what do I get? 6 to 12 pounds yield?
I didn't get that much, but a few
Did
pounds.
Did you get a pound?
Over almost 2.
So
I
then,
was from like 5 plants my first year.
and then you just smoke your brains out until it's
Totally.
gone?
Totally. No, I did get big stainless steel tubs. No, they were all Seavault, I think. And they, do we say Bovida or Bovita?
You can say either and we'll respond, but we say Bovida.
Okay. So I actually didn't put Bovida in the ones that I don't touch it. I'm not opening it and shutting it all the time. And it kept just fine. I gave like all of mine away. I made some tinctures, I made some salves, I made some, I don't know, my mom is in the audience and she smoked a little bit of my weed. Hi Mom. She smoked some of my blueberry muffins when she was out here. But I am a terrible person and I like composted the rest of that first year. I had so much bud and finally like a year and a half later, I was like, I have new bud. I don't need this bud. Anyway, Jamal, though, I have a question for you. As someone who smokes a lot, so are you just unhappy like 6 months of the year because you only like weed for 6 months?
Well, you know, I mean, beggars can't be choosers. Like, think of it like your spice rack. You know, like if you're a chef, you don't use old spices. You just don't because things don't taste as good. Does it still work? It will work, but with the heat and the dryness, the terpene level just leaves. So what happens when the bud gets dry is it oxidizes. The plant material starts to turn brown and is not as smooth, and the trichome starts to degrade, and what's in the trichome, the chemical makeup changes. And so what you're smoking, it gives you a different effect, and the flavor changes, very similar to spices. And, you know, if there's nothing else to smoke, you know, that's definitely what you have to smoke. But, you know, when I was working at the shop, if in July or August, somebody brings me outdoor from the year before, you know, we take it and say thank you, but it's brown old weed. It's kind of like a stale pepper from the back of the convenience store. You know, it's just old. You could still eat it, but you don't really want to.
Timothy is wanting me to talk about packaging and children for the home grower. And so I will just say that I keep everything. I have a toddler and a curious toddler, so everything is kept up high, out of reach. It does give me comfort to know that there's nothing he could do with like a raw flower that is going to get him high. He could, is that true? Andrew's giving me a side nod.
Well, it's mostly going to be THCA and CBDA. I'm pretty sure there's a physiological effect, but it's not the, you know, combusted and then psychoactive form of THC.
Right.
So
My kid is not bud. anymore.
Let's just hope the children don't eat the buds for many reasons.
Get out of the way. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I would encourage that now that this is a legal product, that, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be hidden at all points, but that people can be educated on what it is. You know, and it is an herb, and it's not for kids, it's for adults. But just like a hammer or any other tool, you know, kids know they're not stupid, and, you know, they should be educated that this is not for them. But, you know, legally it does need to be put away and not in their, you know, access.
You know, this is a really good question, though, because when you think of all the child-proof containers that are out in the market for cannabis, and, you know, we're talking about Sea Vault here. Jamal, you've got a mason jar. I've got my Sea Vault here. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Bovida. Thanks, Sea Vault. This is an impermeable container. It has a rubber ring around it, just like a jar does, and then has Bovida packs in it, right? And I think that for the home grower, the best option is something that's impermeable. I won't say whether, you know, mason jars are better than the Sea Vault. I just don't know. But if you have something that holds a seal, you're very likely to get 6 months of shelf life. This is something that's ongoing within Save the Terps to, you know, identify what is the exact amount of time that's reasonable to maintain, you know, some level of quality. But without a doubt, the easiest thing to do is to start with something that's not going to gas off. Again, it's like here we are with the trade-offs between bud rot or, you know, a larger harvest,
Exactly.
early harvest. In this case, the child-proof issue, I think, is one of the biggest ones the industry faces in general, because everyone's terpenes are basically gassing off. And Jamal, like, you made some good points, like how much air is left in that space. And when we look at it, like what's actually going on there, and apply some, you know, basic chemistry and gas laws, pretty much we're looking at terpenes evaporating off, and they're not going to go back into the trichome after they've evaporated off. So this is where it gets really cool of like, why do you want a Bovida pack inside that jar? Well, it's because it's going, just as you go through drying and curing and maintain equilibrium, and you're trying to do that really slowly, get that water content down slow, and then keep it there. You want those elements of a packaging system to like keep the essence and the quality of the product in there. So anything that can improve that is really a win. And if, you know, you're looking to preserve your cannabis for a year, well, you know, follow the advice of keep it in an impermeable container, add a Bovida pack, and really, like, when it gets down to the science of it, you're trying to form a layer of water over the trichome, and anything that keeps that there, fewer openings of the jar, or, you know, a Bovida pack for something that's opened all the time, it really is one of the best ways to, you know, fight the degradation as much as possible and to like literally save the terps.
So we're coming full circle to this whole notion of time. We ran into this in Canada because it's dry as dust in most of Canada, and there's a prolonged period of time between harvest and the cannabis getting to the consumer because it goes through a governmental agency. So you'd go to open your jar in Canada and you'd look at harvest date or the packed on date, and it's 7 or 8 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a highly perishable product. So if it's not properly dried, cured, and stored in the first place, and then packaged, somehow this notion of having a way to save the terps in the packaging process, because even if you're in a sealed glass jar, there's still things going on inside that jar, even though you've stabilized it by putting a sealed, you know, a mason lid on there and clamping it down. There's still something going on inside that jar. And what we've discovered in the research that we've done a lot of testing around this, it has to do with saving the terps, is there's a monolayer of moisture that goes around those trichomes. And it creates, it reduces the amount of terpenes that are being lost. Because Jamal, when you were talking about that process in the drying where there's a certain amount of bad stuff that's going away, totally necessary. But even while that bad stuff is going away, getting the chlorophyll out of the plant and some of those other gases, there's a lot of good stuff that's going away too. And so what we've found is if we can maximize people's pleasures by giving them, instead of a 2 or 3 month window to enjoy that bud, we give them a 6 or an 8 month window to enjoy that bud. It's a dramatic value.
Curing your cannabis, or excuse me, drying it slowly also will extend the shelf life. Essentially, the more terps you can keep on there at the beginning, the longer they will stay on throughout the process. So if you dry your cannabis too quickly, it's going to stay as long. If you let your cannabis go too long, it will actually expire quicker, similar to like a fruit. So, kind of one of the tricks that I try to do or to recommend to people is to harvest some early, dry it really slowly, and never trim it. I think that was something that Johanna was mentioning. You don't need to trim it if you're not smoking it, and it actually stores much better untrimmed. It's dry slower, and all those extra leaves actually protect the trichomes from the UV light getting in there. So really, adding a Bovita, not trimming the weed, and putting it in a vacuum sealed bag, opening it up in June or July, trimming it up, and the bud looks really nice. So that's kind of a little trick I'll use to hold things a little bit longer.
Then there's the other piece of the smokability. People that enjoy great cannabis love the fact that it's not harsh in their throat. It's given them a good the aromas, the whole thing. I mean, there's a lot to it. I think we're getting ready to give this back to Ben, but before we do, I just want to remind people to go to YouTube and to look up Education Council and to watch these 3 episodes. One of the things you'll discover is that Johanna Silver is on each episode. She's a regular here. She's like, she's hawking that book, and you got to get this book. The other things you'll find, you'll have a great conversation with Damian Solomon. You'll have a great conversation with Julia Jacobson from Master Farms. You'll run into some content that's absolutely valuable about every step of this process, from the time you decided to get involved in taking care of cannabis to the time you enjoy it. Today, I want to thank Andrew. Awesome dude. I could talk to you for hours. You're just one of the most intriguing and interesting cats. Jamal, it's so good to meet you. Your experience invaluable to this conversation. I hope we get a chance to interact again. And Johanna, I know that anywhere I tune in about the cannabis world, I'm going to run into you because you're on every one of these shows.
Selling my book. Buy my book everywhere books are sold.
He's also doing Jewish book clubs across the country. Virtually. So
I'll be at the St. Louis Jewish Book Festival, the Detroit.
I'm waiting for New York, for Boston. I'm just waiting for Johanna to continue to make me her booking agent. These interviews across the country. Thank you, all of you, for that. I was listening. It was just fascinating. And really, this is part of why I've been so excited about these episodes, because you guys are, I think, simultaneously helping people understand what they're looking at in their own productions and their own grows, and really understanding what else is out there in the marketplace, because most people that are doing one are also observing. And so this information, I think, is just so fun. I'm thrilled to have this 3rd episode in the can, as it were. Drew, thank you so much for moderating. Really great job. Johanna, you're funny as hell, as always. You're brilliant. You're wonderful. Sell your book. Andrew, thank you for joining us. Jamal, all to Happy Plants and to this little circle of people and folks. And I hope that you'll stay with us and connect with these people. And I already actually, as you were talking, have a couple of ideas about some other places for you to participate. So I will be in touch with you soon if you're interested. And yeah, so thank you to those of you who tuned in, and thank you to those of you who are going to be watching in the future. Go to cannabiscertificationcouncil.org, myweed.org. Google organically grown cannabis, the organically grown cannabis standard and certification that is coming out, we believe, late October, early November, as soon as we finish sorting through all the notes and feedback that we're receiving from the public. And go find those happy plants, people. So thanks so much, and have a great day, morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are, whatever you're doing. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you.